The girl was 18 years old, standing on a bald ridge where the wind blew hard and never stopped, and she was pushing dead sticks into the ground. Jasper Thornwood stood on the road below, squinting up at the ridge, watching the girl and the younger boy working in the grass that grew sideways from the constant wind. He shook his head and said to his wife, "That girl is burying her own hope in the dirt." Many years later, that ridge would carry her name, and Jasper Thornwood would be the first man to call it that. But on this cold morning in early spring, nobody knew what was coming. Nobody knew what the girl understood about wind and willow and the patience required to make dead things live again. They only saw an orphan girl pushing sticks into soil on a ridge where two families had already failed, and they assumed she would fail too. They were wrong about almost everything. The morning dawned cold and gray over the hill country, with a sky the color of old dishwater and a wind that came down from the northwest and found every gap in every wall, in every house for 30 miles. It was the kind of morning that made people stay inside, that made them pull their coats tighter and think about summer, that made them grateful for walls and roofs and the simple gift of shelter. Elara Whitmore turned 18 years old that morning. She woke before dawn in the small room she had occupied for 5 years in the house of her Uncle Horace, in the bed that had belonged to her cousin before her cousin married and moved away. The room was cold. The room was always cold because it faced north and because her uncle did not believe in wasting firewood on rooms that were not his own. She lay in the darkness and listened to the wind against the window glass and thought about what her mother used to say about wind. Her mother, who had come from Cornwall and married an American man and died of lung sickness when Elara was 12, used to say that wind was the breath of the earth, that if you could hear the earth breathing, you knew the earth was alive. Elara could hear the earth breathing now. It was breathing hard and cold against the window of her uncle's house, and she did not know yet that by nightfall she would be sleeping in that wind, with nothing between her and the sky except a wool coat that had belonged to her mother. She rose and dressed in the gray light. One dress worn soft at the elbows, one pair of boots resoled twice. She brushed her hair and pinned it back and went down to the kitchen to make breakfast, as she had made breakfast every morning for 5 years, since she was 13 years old and newly orphaned and taken in by an uncle who viewed charity as a transaction with an expiration date. Her Uncle Horace was already sitting at the kitchen table when she came down. He was 47 years old, with a face like a closed ledger and eyes that calculated everything they saw. He had fed her and housed her and put her to work in his fields alongside his own children, and he had done all of this with the particular generosity of a man who was counting the days until the obligation ended. Today was the day. "Elara," he said. He did not say good morning. He did not say happy birthday. He said her name like he was reading it off a list. "Your things are on the porch." She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. The fire in the stove crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the house, her younger brother Rowan was still sleeping in the room he shared with their cousin's old belongings. "My things," she repeated. "The arrangement is finished." Horace stood up from the table. He was a tall man, thin in the way that men become thin when they believe that wanting less makes them better than other people. You are 18 today. I made a promise to your mother that I would provide for you until you were grown. You are grown. He extended his hand. Alara looked at the hand. It was the hand of a man who believed that 5 years of roof and bread could be concluded with a handshake. The way you close a transaction when both parties have fulfilled their contractual obligations. She shook his hand. What about Rowan? She said. The boy has 3 years remaining on his arrangement. He will stay. He is my brother. He is my nephew, and I have given my word to provide for him until he reaches age. The word is complete in your case. It is not yet complete in his. Horace released her hand. He sat back down at the table and picked up his coffee cup and looked at her with the expression of a man who had completed an unpleasant task and was ready to move on to the next item on his list. Your things are on the porch, he said again. I wish you well. The porch was cold. The wind came around the corner of the house and cut through Alara's dress like the dress was made of paper. Her belongings sat in a canvas sack near the top step. One spare dress, the wool coat that had belonged to her mother, a paring knife, a ball of twine, and $4.30 that she had saved over 5 years from selling eggs that her uncle had let her keep. She put on the wool coat. It smelled faintly of lavender, which was the smell her mother had carried, and wearing it felt like being held by someone who was no longer alive to hold her. The wool was heavy against her shoulders. The collar still held the shape of her mother's neck. And for a moment, standing on that cold porch with the wind cutting through, Alara was not 18 and cast out. She was 12, and her mother was wrapping her in warmth, and the world had not yet broken. Then the moment passed, and she was standing on a porch with everything she owned in a canvas sack. The front door opened behind her. Rowan stood in the doorway. He was 15 years old, tall for his age, with the same dark hair as their mother and the same gray eyes as their father. Their father, who had proven to be the kind of man who viewed fatherhood as a temporary contract that expires when the work gets hard. He had left 2 weeks after their mother's funeral. He had not said goodbye, and he had not come back. Where are you going? Rowan said. It was not a question. He had heard everything through the wall of his room. Away. Where? I don't know yet. Rowan disappeared back into the house. Alara heard voices, her brother's voice high and angry, her uncle's voice flat and final. She heard a door slam. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Then Rowan was back on the porch, carrying his own sack of belongings, wearing his own coat, with his jaw set in the expression that Alara recognized as the expression he wore when he had made a decision that could not be unmade. I am coming with you, he said. You have 3 years left. I am not staying where they threw you out on your birthday. Rowan, don't. He came down the steps and stood beside her. He was already taller than she was, though he was 3 years younger. Don't tell me to stay. Don't tell me it is the smart thing. Don't tell me Uncle Horace will give me a better chance than whatever we are walking toward. I know all of that. I don't care. Behind him in the doorway, a dog appeared. She was 2 years old, a shepherd mix with one ear that stood up and one ear that flopped over, and she had followed Rowan from the barn where she slept among the hay bales. Her name was Thistle, because she had been found as a puppy in a patch of thistles, and she belonged to no one in particular, which meant she belonged to whoever fed her, which meant she belonged to Rowan. Thistle came down the steps and sat beside Rowan's leg, and looked up at Alara with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, are we going or not?" Inside the house, Uncle Horace did not come to the door. He did not call out. He did not tell Rowan to stay or warn him about the consequences of leaving. He simply let them go. Because Horace Whitmore was a man who believed that people who made foolish decisions deserved to suffer the consequences of those decisions. And because too fewer mouths to feed was too fewer mouths to feed, regardless of what he had promised his dead sister. Alara looked at her brother. She looked at the dog. She looked at the road that led south, toward the land office, toward whatever came next. "All right," she said. "Let us go." They walked 7 miles before they found it, the land that nobody wanted. It sat between 2 hollows in the eastern part of the county, a ridge running northeast for a 1/4 mile at a modest elevation. That was not high by hill country standards. The mountains to the east rose much higher. But it was high enough when the ridge was bare of trees and exposed on every side to catch every wind that moved through the region from any direction at any speed. Alara saw it from a mile away. You could not miss it. Everything else was green, the hollows thick with hardwood, the hillsides dark with pine, the valleys soft with the new growth of spring. But the ridge was bald. Brown grass and red clay and stumps rotting into nothing. "What happened there?" Rowan said. "Logging." She knew without being told. Everyone in the county knew about the timber company that had come through years before. They had taken every oak, every hickory, every chestnut. They had come in with mules and left with lumber, and they had not replanted because replanting was not what timber companies did. They had stripped the ridge bare and moved on to the next ridge and the next, leaving behind a landscape of stumps that rotted over the years into soft mounds of nothing, and a ridge so exposed to the wind that nothing new would grow. The stumps had dissolved into the earth. The ridge was bald, grass and scrub and exposed clay, and a wind that blew so constantly that the grass grew at an angle, leaning northeast like the hair on a dog that had been running. "Nobody lives there," Rowan said. "No." "Nobody farms it." "No." "Why?" Alara watched the grass sway in the wind. She watched the clouds move fast across the sky, pushed by the same force that kept the ridge bare and empty. She thought about what her mother used to say. "Wind is the breath of the earth. If you can hear the earth breathing, you know the earth is alive." The ridge was breathing hard. The ridge was alive. The ridge was waiting for someone who understood what that meant. "Because nobody has figured out how yet," she said. "Come on." The county land office occupied a single room in the back of the general store. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, who looked up when Alara and Rowan walked in, and immediately looked back down at his ledger, because young people did not file land claims. Young people worked other people's land until they saved enough money to buy their own. Or they inherited land from family. Or they married into land. Young people did not walk into the land office with a dog at their heels and ask to see the map. "Help you?" the clerk said without looking up. "I want to file a claim." Now he looked up. He looked at Alara, then at Rowan, then at Thistle, who had sat down on the floor and was watching the quirk with the polite attention of a dog who has decided to reserve judgment. A claim? Yes, sir. You are aware that filing a claim requires a fee, and proving a claim requires residence and improvement. Yes, sir. And you are aware that most of the decent land in this county was claimed years ago. Yes, sir. I am not looking for decent land. I am looking for the ridge between the two hollows northeast of here, the bald one. The clerk set down his pen. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his vest and put them back on and looked at her again, as if checking to make sure she was still there and still saying what he thought she was saying. That is the windy one, he said. Yes, sir. 2 families have tried that ridge. How long did they last? He considered this. First family lasted 1 winter. Second family lasted 1 summer. Wind blew them both off. Wind blows everything off that ridge. Yes, sir. I would like to file a claim. The clerk looked at her for a long moment. He was not a cruel man, and he was not an unkind man, but he was a practical man who had seen many foolish decisions walk through his door, and he had learned that there was no point in arguing with foolish decisions. Foolish decisions had to discover their own foolishness in their own time. He pulled out the appropriate form. He dipped his pen in ink. Name? Ilara Whitmore. Age? 18 today. He wrote. He stamped the form with the county seal. He did not wish her luck because he did not believe in luck, and because he did not believe she would need luck as much as she would need sense. And sense was something she clearly did not have. Filing fee is deferred until you prove the claim, he said. You have 2 years. If you are still there in 2 years, you can pay the fee and the land is yours. If you are not still there, it goes back to the county. He handed her the paper. Good luck, he said, though he did not believe in it. They climbed to the ridge that afternoon. The wind hit them before they reached the top. It came from the northwest at a speed that made Alara's coat flap against her body like a sail, and it drove the cold through every layer of fabric she wore and into the spaces between her ribs. It was early spring. The temperature was perhaps 43 degrees. That was not dangerously cold by hill country standards, but 43 degrees in a strong wind feels like 25. And 25 degrees with no shelter feels like a decision you should reconsider. Ilara did not reconsider. She stood at the top of the ridge and looked at what she had claimed. A 1/4 mile of bald earth running northeast, dotted with the soft mounds of rotted stumps. Brown grass that grew at an angle because the wind had bent it since the day it sprouted. Red clay showing through in patches where even the grass had given up. And wind. Wind that never stopped. Wind that came from everywhere at once and found no obstacle to slow it down. This is it, Rowan said. He had to shout over the wind. This is it. There is nothing here. There is land. There is sky. There is us. Rowan looked at her with an expression that mixed doubt with loyalty in equal measure. He was 15 years old, and he had followed his sister into the wind because he loved her more than he loved safety. But he was still 15 years old, and he was cold. And the ridge looked like a place where hope came to die. Thistle, for her part, seemed unbothered. She trotted across the ridge grass with her ears back against the wind and her nose working. investigating this new territory with the pragmatic curiosity of a dog who understood that territory was territory, regardless of how the wind blew. "Where do we sleep?" Rowan said. Alara pointed to a depression behind the largest stump on the ridge. It was not much, a shallow dip in the earth where the roots had once grown, now rotted away into a bowl-shaped hollow, perhaps 4 feet across and 2 feet deep. It would block some of the wind. Not much, but some. "There," she said, "for tonight." They gathered grass and piled it in the depression for insulation. They ate the bread that Alara had taken from her uncle's kitchen that morning. The last food they would have for a while, unless they could find or earn more. They wrapped themselves in their coats and lay down in the hollow, with thistle stretched across their legs. And the wind came over the top of the ridge and found them anyway, pushing through the grass and through their coats and into their bones. The temperature dropped as the sun went down. 40, 38, 35. Rowan shivered against Alara's side. His teeth chattered. His whole body shook with the effort of trying to stay warm in a place that did not want him to stay warm. "Tell me about what Mama used to say," he whispered. "About the wind." Alara pulled him closer. She pulled her coat tighter around both of them. Thistle pressed harder against their legs, adding whatever warmth a 40-pound dog could add to 2 freezing humans. "She used to say wind was the breath of the earth," Alara said. "She used to say that if you could hear the earth breathing, you knew the earth was alive. She used to say that people who understood wind could live anywhere, because wind was just air in a hurry, and air in a hurry could be convinced to slow down if you knew how to ask." "How do you ask?" "I don't know yet." Alara looked up at the stars, which were sharp and clear and cold in the spring sky. "But I am going to figure it out." She built a shelter. The first shelter was sod. She cut sod bricks from the ridge grass, the same method that had worked on the western prairies and the flatlands and everywhere else where people needed walls and had more dirt than trees. She stacked the bricks 3 feet high in a U-shape on the lee side of the ridge, with the open end facing south, away from the prevailing northwest wind. She roofed it with branches she gathered from the hollow below, tied down with the ball of twine from her canvas sack. It took her 4 days to build. Rowan helped, carrying bricks and gathering branches and doing whatever Alara told him to do without complaint. Thistle supervised, lying in patches of sunlight when there was sunlight, watching them work with the patient expression of a dog who had seen many human projects and knew that most human projects ended in failure, but was willing to wait and see. The shelter lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, the wind shifted. It came from the southwest instead of the northwest, a direction the U-shape was not designed to deflect. It caught the roof at an angle and peeled it off in one piece, with a sound like a bedsheet being snapped, and deposited it 30 feet downhill in the scrub, where it landed upside down and looked like a bird's nest that had been evicted from a very large bird. The sod walls, without the weight of the roof holding them together, shifted and sagged, and by the following morning looked like a row of melting candles. Rowan stood in the ruins of their shelter and looked at his sister with eyes that held a question he was afraid to ask. "We rebuild," Alara said. They rebuilt. She oriented the U-shape differently this time, with the open end facing east instead of south. She made the walls 4 feet high instead of 3, and stacked the sod tighter, and used heavier branches for the roof, and doubled the twine. It lasted 9 days. On the 10th day, the wind came from the east. It came from the east because wind in hill country does not read plans, and does not care about prevailing directions. It drove straight through the opening with a force that knocked the cooking pot off the stone Alara used as a table, and scattered the coals from her fire across the floor. The roof went again. The walls sagged again. Rowan sat in the debris of their second failure, and this time he did not look at his sister. He looked at his hands, which were red and raw from cutting sod and carrying bricks. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Ilara rebuilt a 3rd time. This time, she built the shelter fully enclosed. No opening except a low crawl-through on the south side, 2 feet square, covered with a flap she cut from her mother's wool coat. She was now modifying her only winter garment for the sake of a shelter that had already failed twice. Cutting a square from the back of the coat and sewing the remaining pieces together into something that would still keep her warm, but would not look like anything her mother had ever worn. The sacrifice was not lost on her. She held the cut piece of wool in her hands and felt the lavender scent rise from the fibers. And she understood that she was dismantling the last physical thing that connected her to her mother, in order to survive on a ridge that might not let her survive at all. The coat that had held the shape of her mother's shoulders would never hold that shape again. The 3rd shelter was sealed. The 3rd shelter was tight. The 3rd shelter would not lose its roof to the wind, because there was nothing for the wind to catch. The wind found the crawl-through anyway. It funneled through the 2-foot opening at twice the speed of the open air, creating a jet of cold that made the interior colder than the outside, and blew ash from the fire pit into Alara's eyes, and her food, and her one remaining dress. She blocked the crawl-through with packed sod. Now she had a sealed box with no ventilation. The moisture from her breath and her body and the damp sod itself condensed on the walls and ran down in rivulets that soaked her blanket and her clothes and turned the floor to mud. She lay in the dark on the wet floor and listened to the wind howl over the top of the walls. And she understood, not with anger, not with self-pity, not with the despair that might have been expected from a girl who had failed 3 times at the same thing while sleeping in a box of mud on a ridge where the wind never stopped. She understood with the cold clarity that comes from having failed enough times to recognize what failure is trying to teach. She was doing it wrong. She sat outside the failed shelter on that spring morning and looked at the ridge and understood something that the 2 families before her had also understood, but too late. The problem was not the building. The problem was the wind. No shelter she could build on this ridge would survive unless the wind was stopped before it reached the shelter. And the wind could not be stopped by a wall. A wall is a single line, and the wind comes from every direction and finds every gap and presses on every surface until something gives. The wind could not be stopped by anything she could build, but the wind could be stopped by something she could grow. She looked at the rotted stumps scattered across the ridge. She looked at the bald earth where trees had once stood. She thought about what the clerk at the land office had told her. 2 families had failed. The wind blew everything off this ridge. The wind blew everyone off this ridge. But the wind had not always blown everything off. Before the timber company, this ridge had been covered with trees. Oak and hickory and chestnut, tall enough and thick enough to shelter whatever grew beneath them. The trees had stood against the wind for 100 years, maybe longer. They had created a place where other things could live. The timber company had not just taken lumber, they had taken shelter. They had not just removed wood, they had removed the living windbreak that had protected this ridge for longer than anyone could remember. The stumps were the proof, but Ilara could not plant oak trees. An oak takes 20 years to reach windbreak height, and she did not have 20 years. She did not have 20 months. She needed something that would grow fast, root deep, stand against the wind within a single season. She needed to find someone who knew what that something was. And she thought of her mother. Her mother, who had talked about the willow trees along the creek banks in Cornwall. Her mother, who had said that willow was the fastest thing with roots. That her own grandmother had planted willow stakes along the shore, and they had rooted in days. That willow did not fight the wind. Willow bent. Willow yielded. That was why willow survived what oak did not. Ilara stood up. The wind pushed at her back. The ridge stretched out before her, bald and hostile and waiting. Somewhere in the hollows below, there had to be someone who knew about willows, someone who remembered what her mother had known, someone who could teach her how to grow on a ridge where nothing would stand. She did not know yet that the woman she needed was already watching her from the hollow below, that the woman had been watching for weeks, waiting to see if the girl on the ridge would give up like the others, or if she would do what no one else had done, if she would stop building and start growing. But that meeting was still days away, and before it came, something else arrived on the ridge. The man who appeared at the edge of the ridge that afternoon was not there to help. His name was Silas Garrick. He was 38 years old, and he wore a suit that was too fine for the hill country. And he smiled, the way men smile when they want something and believe that smiling will help them get it. Ilara was sitting beside the ruins of her third shelter when he appeared. She had not heard him coming. The wind covered all sounds on this ridge. But Thistle had. The dog stood between Ilara and the stranger, her hackles raised, a low growl building in her throat. "Miss Whitmore," Garrick said, "I have heard about your difficulties." She did not stand up. She did not greet him. "Who are you?" "Silas Garrick. I deal in land. I buy, I sell, I find opportunities for people who want them." He looked at the collapsed sod walls, at the scattered branches, at the flap of wool that had been cut from a coat. "I heard that you have had some trouble on this ridge. 3 shelters, was it not? All destroyed by the wind?" He smiled again, the patient smile of a man who believes his patience is a gift to the person he is waiting for. "I am prepared to make you an offer. $15 for your claim. That is 3 times the filing fee. You walk away with money in your pocket, and I take on the ridge of this ridge." Ilara looked at him. She looked at his fine suit and his polished shoes and his smile that did not reach his eyes. "Why would you want to buy land that everyone says is worthless?" "Investment. I like to invest in land that other people have given up on," Sometimes the potential is not obvious to those without vision. What potential do you see that I do not? The smile flickered, just for a moment, but Ilara saw it. Something behind the patience, something behind the polish. He knew something about this ridge that he was not telling her, something that made $15 a bargain and her failure a convenience. "I have said enough," Garrick replied. $15, Miss Whitmore, cash in hand. You can start over somewhere easier, somewhere the wind does not destroy everything you try to build. Ilara stood up. The wind pushed at her back, and she felt it now, not as an enemy, but as something waiting to be understood. "The land is not for sale," she said. Garrick put the money away. His smile had gone cold now, the way smiles go cold when they stop being a tactic and start being a mask. "You will change your mind," he said. "Everyone changes their mind when the wind blows long enough." He turned and walked back down the ridge, picking his way through the grass with the careful steps of a man who does not want to muddy his fine shoes. Rowan appeared from behind a stump where he had been listening. What did he want? The ridge. Why? Ilara watched Garrick's retreating figure, watched him reach the road and turn east toward town, watched him disappear around the curve of the hollow. "I do not know yet," she said, "but I intend to find out." She looked back at the ridge, at the ruins of her third shelter, at the stumps rotting in the grass, at the wind that bent everything it touched. Somewhere in the hollow below, unseen, a white-haired woman with a walking stick stood at the edge of the tree line and watched the girl on the ridge refuse to leave. The woman had watched the 3 shelters go up and come down. She had watched the girl cut her own mother's coat to make a door. She had watched and waited, the way you wait for a seed to crack open, the way you wait for a root to take hold. The woman turned and walked back down into the hollow. She would come tomorrow, or the day after. She would come when the girl was ready to hear what the woman had spent 61 years learning. That you cannot build on a ridge like that. You can only grow on it. And growth takes a different kind of patience than building. Growth takes the patience of women who plant things they will never see fully grown, who push dead sticks into dirt and call it faith, who understand that the wind is not the enemy. The wind is just air in a hurry. And air in a hurry can be convinced to slow down, if you know how to ask. The woman who came up the ridge on the 2nd day of May was 61 years old, with white hair that flew in the wind like a flag of surrender, and eyes that surrendered nothing. She carried a walking stick that she did not seem to need, and she climbed the slope from the northern hollow with the steady pace of someone who had climbed many slopes and would climb many more before she was done. Her name was Prudence Ashford. She had lived in the hollow below the north side of the ridge for 37 years, ever since she had married Ezra Ashford and moved from her family's farm in the valley to the Ashford homestead in the hills. She had raised 4 children in that hollow and buried one of them, and watched the others grow and scatter to their own lives in their own places. She had seen the timber company come through, and she had watched the ridge go bald, and she had observed, with the detached interest of a woman who understood that foolishness eventually defeats itself, as 2 families tried to live on that ridge and failed. Now she had come to see whether the girl doing it was aware that sod walls on the bald ridge had a life expectancy roughly equal to a mayfly's. She found Alara sitting beside the ruins of the third shelter, staring at the grass with an expression that was not defeat, but was not victory either. Rowan was gathering the scattered remnants of their belongings. Thistle was lying in a patch of morning sun, watching the old woman climb with the calm attention of a dog who had learned that not all strangers were threats. Prudence stopped at the edge of what had been the shelter. She looked at the collapsed sod walls. She looked at the scattered branches. She looked at the flap of wool that had been cut from a coat. She looked at the girl who sat among the ruins and did not stand up when an elder approached. "You cannot build on this ridge," Prudence said. Her voice carried easily over the wind, clear and certain and without judgment. Ilara looked up at her. "Then what can I do?" "You can grow on it." Something shifted in Ilara's eyes. Something opened like a door that had been waiting for someone to knock. "Grow what?" "Nothing grows here. The wind kills everything. Oak will not grow. Hickory will not grow. They take too long, and the wind breaks them before they are strong enough to stand." Prudence set her walking stick against her shoulder and looked out over the bald ridge, at the grass swaying in the constant wind, at the stumps rotting into the earth. "Willow grows," she said. "Willow grows faster than anything else that has roots. There is no willow on this ridge because nobody has planted it, but there is willow in every creek bottom in this county, including the creek that runs below my house." Prudence looked at Ilara with an expression that mixed assessment with something that might have been recognition. The old woman was seeing something in the girl that the girl could not yet see in herself. "My grandmother planted willow stakes along the creek bank in Cornwall to hold the soil," Prudence continued. "She cut branches as thick as her thumb, pushed them into the ground, and they rooted. Every one." Rowan had stopped gathering and was listening now. Thistle's ears were up, following the conversation as if she understood it. "Willow does not need anything but wet ground and time," Prudence said. "A willow stake planted in spring is a willow tree by autumn, 6 feet tall, flexible, alive. And willow does not fight the wind the way oak fights. Willow gives way. Willow yields. That is why willow survives what oak does not." Ilara stood up. The wind pushed at her back as if trying to move her toward the old woman, toward whatever was being offered. "But the ground up here is not wet," she said. "It is dry. The rain runs off. Nothing holds water on this ridge." Prudence smiled. It was the smile of a teacher who has found a student capable of asking the right questions. "It will be wet," she said, "if you dig a swale." A swale is a shallow ditch dug along a contour line, not to drain water away, but to catch it and hold it, letting it soak into the ground on the downhill side. The technique was old, older than anyone could remember, passed down through generations of farmers who had learned that water goes where you tell it to go, if you know how to ask. Prudence showed Ilara where to dig. A crescent-shaped trench, 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide, curving across the northwest face of the ridge where the worst wind came from. The crescent followed the contour of the slope, which meant that every rain that fell on the uphill side would pool in the swale and soak into the ground along the trench line. The ground along the trench line would stay wet. Wet ground could grow willow. Willow could stop wind. It was so simple. It was so obvious. It was the kind of knowledge that seems inevitable once you hear it, as if you had always known it and had only been waiting for someone to remind you. Ilara dug it in 2 days. 300 feet of crescent, 18 inches deep, carved into the clay of the ridge by hand, with a spade she borrowed from Prudence, and a determination that Prudence later described to her husband Ezra as the most impressive thing she had seen on that ridge, including the time lightning had struck the last standing oak. Rowan helped. He carried dirt. He shaped the walls of the trench. He did not complain about his blistered hands, or his aching back, or the fact that he was digging a ditch on a windy ridge because his sister believed an old woman who said that sticks could become trees in 6 months. Thistle supervised. She walked the length of the swale each morning, inspecting the work with the serious attention of a dog who understood that humans required supervision if they were going to do anything correctly. On the 10th of May, Prudence returned to the ridge. She did not come alone. She came carrying bundles. She came carrying willow stakes. 440 of them, each one fresh cut and ready to root. Cut at an angle at the base so they could be pushed into soil. She had spent a week cutting them from the willow stand along the creek below her property. She carried them in bundles of 20, tied with strips of bark, and she made 4 trips up the ridge before all the bundles were stacked beside the freshly dug swale. "My grandmother would be proud," she said, looking at the stakes piled in the grass. 440 chances to live. They planted them in a single day. 1 stake every 12 inches along the downhill side of the swale, pushed 18 inches into the wet ground, tamped with a boot heel until it stood steady against the wind. Ilara planted. Rowan tamped. Prudence supervised, correcting technique, adjusting angles, making sure each stake went deep enough to reach the moisture that the swale was designed to provide. 440 stakes in a crescent 300 feet long across the northwest face of the bald ridge. From the road below, it looked like someone had planted a fence of dead sticks in a ditch on a windy ridge. It looked exactly like what it was. A desperate measure taken by a desperate girl who had failed 3 times at building shelter and was now trying something that no one in the county had ever seen before. Prudence brought more than knowledge to the ridge. She brought food. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried beans in a jar, a sack of flour that would last 2 weeks if they were careful. She did not call it charity. She called it payment for the labor of digging the swale. And when the flour was gone, Ilara learned to forage in the hollows below. Wild greens in spring, berries in summer, nuts in fall. She learned which roots were edible and which streams held crawfish, and which patches of ground grew the onions that tasted like dirt but kept you alive. She traded willow stakes at the general store for provisions. 2 cents a stake, enough to keep hunger at arm's length, if not out of sight entirely. They were never full, but they were never starving. And the ridge provided more than anyone had expected from land that everyone called worthless. The waiting began. Ilara walked the full 300 feet of the crescent every morning at dawn, before the wind rose to its full strength, before the sun climbed high enough to make her squint. She walked with her hands in the pockets of her shortened coat, and she stopped at each stake and pulled gently, feeling for resistance. For 8 days the stakes moved when she pulled. They shifted in the soft soil. They gave way to the pressure of her fingers. They were dead sticks stuck in dirt, just as Jasper Thornwood had said from the road below, and they showed no sign of becoming anything else. On the third day of waiting, Alara pulled a stake and it came loose in her hand, pale and dry. She pushed it back in. On the fifth day, she found 7 more that had gone soft at the base, their bark peeling, their wood turning the color of old bone. She replaced them with spares from the bundle Prudence had left. On the 6th day, it rained. Cold rain, driven sideways by the wind. The kind of rain that makes you question every decision you have ever made. The swale filled with water that ran brown with clay and soaked into the ground along the trench line exactly as Prudence had said it would. But the stakes looked no different. Dead sticks in wet dirt. On the 7th night, Rowan looked at her across the fire they had built in the hollow of the old stump, and she saw something in his eyes she had not seen before. Doubt. Not the playful doubt of a younger brother who teases his sister. The real doubt of a boy who is beginning to wonder if he had followed her into a mistake. "What if they don't root?" he said. Alara did not answer immediately. She stared at the fire and listened to the wind and felt the weight of the question. Because she had been asking herself the same thing every morning when she walked the crescent and felt the stakes shift under her fingers. What if Prudence was wrong? What if the soil was too thin? What if the wind dried the roots before they could take hold? What if this was just another kind of failure, slower than sod walls, but just as final? "Then we try something else," she said. But her voice did not carry the certainty it had carried before, and Rowan heard the difference, and Thistle heard the difference, and the wind heard the difference, and blew harder as if to test it. On the 9th morning, they held. Not all of them. 23 stakes came loose when she pulled, their bark dry and pale, their bases soft in the soil. But the others, 417 stakes out of 440 resisted her pull. They tugged back. They gripped the earth with something that had not been there before. Roots. Alara pulled harder on one of the stakes, testing it. The stake flexed, but did not come loose. She could feel the resistance in her fingers, the slight give, and then the firm hold, the sensation of something alive anchoring itself to the ground. "Rowan," she called, "come here." Her brother came running from the shelter. They were still sleeping in the depression behind the old stump, still waiting for something better, still living on the hope that something better was possible. "Pull this one," Alara said. He pulled. The stake flexed. The stake held. "It is stuck," he said. "It is rooted." Rowan looked at the stake. He looked at the 300 feet of crescent stretching across the northwest face of the ridge. He looked at his sister, whose eyes were bright with something he had not seen since the morning they had left their uncle's house. All of them? Not all, but most. Enough. Rowan let go of the stake. He stood back. He looked at the crescent of willow stakes, 417 of which were no longer stakes, but were becoming something else. Something that would grow and sway and stand against the wind that had defeated everything else on this ridge. Then he did something he had not done since they arrived. He smiled. Not a small smile, not a polite smile, a real smile, The kind that splits a face and crinkles eyes and makes a person look like a child again, regardless of their age. "Ilara," he said. "It is working." Thistle, who had followed Rowan from the shelter, began to bark. She ran the length of the swale, barking at each stake as if celebrating their success, as if she understood what was happening and approved of it, and wanted the whole hollow to know. Ilara knelt beside one of the stakes that had rooted. She looked at the bark, which was still gray and weathered, still looking dead, but somewhere inside that bark, sap was moving. Water was climbing. Life was beginning. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." The skeptics did not wait for proof. They had already made up their minds, and proof was not something that interested them. But the willows did not care about opinions. The willows grew. And the county talked. These two things happened simultaneously, feeding each other the way rain feeds both crops and weeds. The buds appeared in early June, tiny and pale, pushing through the bark like the ridge itself was learning to speak again after years of silence. That same week, Jasper Thornwood told anyone who would listen at the general store that sticks in dirt were still sticks in dirt, no matter what color they turned. He stood on the road below the ridge and shook his head with the certainty of a man who had already written the ending. The first leaves unfurled by mid-June, small and narrow and trembling in the constant wind, but unmistakably alive. That Sunday, Reverend Whitmore preached about pride from his pulpit. He did not name Ilara. Men like the Reverend rarely named the subjects of their sermons. But everyone in the congregation knew. The orphan girl who thought she knew better than the families who had failed before her. The stranger who had planted sticks in the ground, as if sticks could stop the wind. "Pride," the Reverend said, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms. "Pride is the sin that makes us believe we are wiser than those who came before. Pride is the sin that sets us up for the fall that humbles us." In the back of the church, Prudence Ashford sat with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on the Reverend's face. She did not nod. She did not say amen. When the service ended, she walked to the front where the Reverend was shaking hands with his departing flock. "Fine sermon," Prudence said. Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes were not. "Thank you, Prudence." "That girl on the ridge, the one you were warning us about. She is 18 years old and orphaned, and trying to build a life on land that nobody else wanted. And you are calling her prideful from your pulpit, while she is digging ditches with her bare hands." The Reverend's smile tightened. "I was speaking in generalities. You were speaking about Ilara Whitmore, and my grandmother planted willow stakes in Cornwall. Same method, same technique. Those willows stood for 60 years through every storm the coast could throw at them." Prudence leaned closer. "You might want to reconsider your sermon next week. Pride is indeed a sin, but so is bearing false witness against your neighbor." She walked out of the church without waiting for his response. The willows reached 4 feet by July. Colton Briggs came up the ridge itself, leading a group of young men from town who had heard about the girl with the willow fence and wanted to see for themselves. "Hey, orphan girl!" he called out, loud enough for Ilara to hear from 50 feet away. "You building a house or digging a grave?" The young men laughed. Colton grinned, pleased with his wit. "I have got $2, says you are gone by October," he continued. "Anyone want to take the other side?" Anyone want to bet on the orphan girl and her stick fence? Rowan started toward them, his hands balling into fists. But Alara caught his arm. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "They are making bets on us failing. When we prove them wrong, that will be better than punching them." Colton waited for a response that did not come. When she simply turned back to her work and continued as if he were not there, his grin faded into something smaller and meaner. "Fine," he said. "Keep your silence. We will see who is laughing come winter." He turned and led his group back down the ridge, but not before dropping a piece of paper from his pocket. A betting slip. Proof of his wager, left behind like a taunt. Alara picked it up later. She read the scrawled handwriting. Colton Briggs, $2. Whitmore girl gone by October 1st. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She did not throw it away. She wanted to remember. The willows reached 6 feet by August. Dr. Franklin Mercer climbed the ridge, claiming concern for Alara's health. He was 55 years old, the only doctor in the county, with a certainty about his own expertise that exceeded his actual knowledge by a considerable margin. He huffed up the slope with his black bag in one hand and found Alara laying the foundation for her stone house in the calm space behind the willow crescent. "Miss Whitmore, I have come to check on your well-being. I did not ask for a doctor." "No, but as the medical professional in this community, I have a responsibility to all residents, including those who have placed themselves in situations that may prove detrimental to their health." Alara set down the stone she was holding. "You can tell whoever sent you that the answer is no. The land is not for sale. Not for $15, not for $50, not for any amount." The doctor's face reddened. "I came of my own accord." "You came because Silas Garrick asked you to, or because someone else asked you to. Someone who wants me gone from this ridge." She picked up the stone and fitted it into place. "Tell them all the same thing. I will be here in October. I will be here in winter. And when spring comes, I will still be here." She looked up at him. Her eyes were steady. "You will see." Margaret Holloway, wife of the wealthiest landowner in the county, never climbed the ridge at all. She simply talked. At the general store while buying flour. At the church social while arranging flowers. Wherever women gathered, in the careful tones of someone who was only expressing concern. That poor orphan girl, living up on that windy ridge with no proper guidance, listening to old Prudence Ashford of all people. They say she is planting sticks and calling them trees. Margaret never mentioned that her husband had been approached by Silas Garrick about buying the ridge. She never mentioned that if Alara failed, the land would go back to the county. She only talked about what a shame it was. And behind all of it, unseen but present like the wind itself, Garrick worked. He did not come back to the ridge himself. He whispered to the doctor. He whispered to Margaret. He raised questions at the land office about whether a young unmarried woman could legally hold a claim. He bought drinks for men at the general store and mentioned, casually, that the girl on the ridge was unstable, that she was wasting good land. He was building something too, not with willow stakes and swales, but with doubt and rumor and the slow erosion of a community's patience. And he was doing it because he knew something that Alara did not yet know. that a railroad line might come through this part of the county, that the ridge sat on land that would be valuable if the tracks came close enough, that $15 was not an offer but a theft, and that Alara's stubbornness was costing him more with every day she stayed. But the Willows did not care about Garrick's plans. By the end of July, the stakes were no longer stakes. They were willow shoots, each one between 4 and 6 feet tall, flexible and green, with root systems that had spread 18 inches in every direction, gripping the swale soil like fingers gripping a rope. The crescent along the northwest face of the ridge was now a living wall. It moved with the wind rather than resisting it. It swayed and absorbed the energy of the gusts rather than trying to block them flat. And behind the crescent, on the downhill side, the air was different. Alara stood in that different air on an evening in late July and felt the change against her skin. The wind still moved. The wind would always move on this ridge. But it moved slower now, gentler. The willows had taken the force of the gusts and softened it, absorbed it, transformed it from a wall of pressure into a breeze that barely stirred the grass. "Rowan," she said, "come here." He came and stood beside her. Thistle came and sat at their feet. They stood in the calm space behind the willow crescent and felt the wind passing over them instead of through them. "Do you feel that?" Alara said. "It is quiet. Not quiet, different. The wind is still there, but it is not fighting us anymore." Rowan closed his eyes. He let the breeze touch his face, the gentle remnant of the wind that was howling on the other side of the willow wall. "Mama was right," he said. "Wind is just air in a hurry, and you figured out how to ask it to slow down." It was in those weeks of growth, while the willows climbed toward the sky and the stone foundation took shape behind them, that Prudence told Alara the truth. They were sitting on the ridge at dusk, watching the willow leaves catch the last light. Rowan had gone down to the creek to fill the water buckets. Thistle was asleep at their feet. The wind was gentle behind the crescent, and the air smelled of green things growing, and it was the kind of evening that makes hard things seem possible. "There is something I have not told you," Prudence said. Her voice was different, quieter, careful in a way that her voice was never careful. Alara waited. "I had a daughter, my youngest. Her name was Ada." Prudence looked at the willows, not at Alara, at the willows. "Ada wanted to plant willows on this ridge. She talked about it the way your mother talked about wind. She had the same knowledge, the same understanding. She had read everything my grandmother ever wrote about willow cultivation. She wanted to prove it could work." "What happened?" "She married. Her husband was a practical man, a good man in his way. But practical men do not plant willow stakes on bald ridges. Practical men do not take risks that might fail. He told her it was foolish. He told her the wind would destroy everything she planted. He told her what everyone in this county has been telling you." Prudence's hands were still in her lap. Her voice was steady, but something behind her eyes was not steady at all. She listened to him. She did not plant. She did not try. And she died without ever knowing if she was right. The wind moved through the willow leaves. The sound was like breathing. "That was many years ago," Prudence said. And I have spent every year since then watching this ridge go bald, and thinking about what my daughter might have done if someone had told her to stop listening to practical men. She turned to look at Alara, and Alara understood, suddenly and completely, why this woman had climbed the ridge on a May morning with a walking stick she did not need. Why she had carried 440 willow stakes up a hill in 4 trips. Why she had spent a week cutting them from the creek bank with her own hands at 61 years old, with arthritic fingers and a back that ached in the rain. It was not just knowledge. It was not just proof. It was the thing she could not do for her own daughter, done for a stranger's daughter instead. You are not just helping me, Alara said. No, you are planting what Ada never got to plant. Prudence said nothing. She did not need to. The willows moved in the wind, and the sound they made was answer enough. But the understanding between them did not prevent the disagreement that came later. In fact, it may have caused it. By late August, the willows were 8 feet tall, and their branches were beginning to weave together into a dense wall. The calm space behind the crescent was expanding. Alara could feel the possibility growing along with the trees. She wanted to move faster. She wanted to begin the second crescent on the southeast face. She wanted to start the stone walls of the house that would stand in the sheltered space. She wanted to do everything at once, because 2 years is not long, and winter was coming. And every day the willows grew was a day closer to the test that would prove whether any of this would hold. I am going to start the second crescent, she told Prudence one morning, and the stone foundation, at the same time. Prudence shook her head. Too soon. The willows are 8 feet tall. The crescent is working. I can feel the difference. The willows are 8 months old. Their roots are shallow. The first crescent needs another season to anchor. If you stretch yourself across 2 projects, you will do both badly. I do not have another season. I have 2 years to prove this claim, and half of one is already gone. Then spend the second half strengthening what you have built, not spreading yourself thin across things that are not ready. Alara felt something rise in her chest, something hot and sharp that she had not felt toward Prudence before. You watched this ridge for 37 years, she said. 37 years of watching it sit bald and empty and doing nothing about it. You had the knowledge. You had the willow. You had everything Ada needed, and you let the years pass. Do not tell me about patience. The words hung in the air between them. The wind moved through the willows. Thistle raised her head from the ground and looked from one woman to the other with the anxious expression of a dog who senses that the humans have made a mistake. Prudence's face did not change. It went very still, the way faces go still when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. She picked up her walking stick. She stood. She looked at Alara for a long moment, with eyes that held hurt and recognition in equal measure. Because the girl was right. And because being right is not always the same as being kind. I will come back when you are ready to listen, Prudence said. She walked down the ridge. She did not look back. Alara stood alone in the wind and felt the silence where Prudence had been. It was a different kind of silence than the silence of the ridge. It was the silence of something broken between 2 people, and it sat in her chest heavier than the wind had ever sat. She started the second crescent anyway. She dug the swale herself, without Prudence's guidance on placement. She cut willow stakes from the lower hollow, choosing branches that looked thick enough, but that she was not certain were the right species. She planted them along the southeast face, where the morning sun hit strongest, and she began laying the stone foundation for the house in the calm space behind the first crescent. She worked 18 hours a day. She carried stones from the creek below, each one chosen for its flat surfaces and its weight. Each one hauled up the ridge on her back, while the wind pushed against her like a hand trying to hold her down. She mixed clay mortar from the ridge soil and packed it between the stones and watched the walls rise, course by course. Rowan worked beside her. He did not ask about Prudence. He did not ask why the old woman had stopped coming. He carried stones and mixed mortar and cut stakes and did what his sister told him to do. And if he noticed that the mortar was cracking in places where the wind found gaps, he did not say so. Alara noticed. She noticed the hairline fractures spreading through the clay like veins in a leaf. She noticed the way the wind whistled through the gaps at night, thin and high and cold. She noticed that the walls were rising, but they were not rising right. That the speed she had demanded was costing her the precision that Prudence would have insisted on. But she did not slow down. Because slowing down felt like admitting that Prudence was right. And admitting that Prudence was right meant admitting what she had said about 37 years of watching and doing nothing. And that was a thing she could not take back, and could not make right by being careful with mortar. On an afternoon in late September, a girl climbed the ridge. She was 16 years old, the daughter of farmers who lived in the hollow below the eastern slope. She had watched Alara work all summer, observing from a distance, never approaching, never speaking. Her name was Emmeline Garner. She had curious eyes and hands that showed calluses from farm work, and a small notebook in her pocket that she pulled out the way other people pulled out handkerchiefs. "I have questions," she said. Alara looked up from the wall she was building. The stone in her hand was heavy, and the mortar on her fingers was drying in the wind, and she was tired, in a way that went deeper than muscles. "What questions?" "Why willow instead of oak? Oak is stronger. Oak takes 20 years to reach windbreak height. Willow takes 5 months. Why the ditch? Why not just plant them in regular ground? The ditch holds water. Water keeps the soil wet. Wet soil grows willow faster. Why do you weave the branches together?" "Because woven branches make a denser wall. A denser wall means less wind gets through." Emmeline absorbed each answer with the intensity of someone who intended to remember every word. She wrote something in her notebook. "Can I come back?" she asked. "Can I come back and learn more?" Alara looked at the girl, at her curious eyes and her calloused hands, and her notebook full of questions. And she saw something she recognized, a hunger for knowledge, a desire to understand, the same thing she had felt when Prudence first explained about willows and swales and yielding instead of fighting. "You can come back whenever you want," she said, "but you have to be willing to work while you learn." "I will work." "And you have to be willing to fail, because I am still learning too, and I fail more often than I succeed." "I am not afraid of failing," Emmeline said. "I am afraid of never trying." It was the right answer. Alara knew it was the right answer because it was the answer she would have given herself, before she had learned that trying was the only way to find out what was possible. "Then come back tomorrow," she said. "We will start with the swale." The old man who climbed the ridge the following week moved with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned that hurrying accomplished nothing that could not be accomplished better by patience. His name was Jeremiah Boone, and he was 78 years old, and he did not speak when he reached the top. He stood at the edge of the willow crescent and looked at the green shoots that had grown to 8 feet tall, their branches beginning to weave together into a living wall that moved with the wind instead of fighting it. He looked at the stone foundation taking shape behind the willows, at the walls that were rising course by course. He stood and looked for a long time. Then he said, "My grandmother planted willows like these in Wales. I was a boy, 5, maybe 6 years old. She took me to the creek bank where she had planted willow stakes 40 years before. They were trees by then, tall trees. And she said to me, 'Jeremiah, these trees will stand when I am gone. They will stand when you are old. They will stand when your grandchildren are old, because willow knows how to give way.'" He walked along the edge of the crescent, running his hand across the leaves that trembled in the breeze. "Everyone in this county thinks you are foolish," he said. "They think you will fail like the others failed. They do not understand what you are doing." He turned to look at her, and his eyes held something that might have been recognition, or might have been memory, or might have been hope. "My grandmother's willows are still standing, 90 years later, through every storm that Wales could throw at them. Some knowledge does not come from books or schools or experts. It comes from grandmothers who planted willows by creek banks and showed their grandchildren what it means to yield instead of shatter." He did not say anything else. He did not offer to help. He walked back down the ridge with the same slow deliberation with which he had climbed it, leaving Alara with the knowledge that at least 2 people in this county understood what she was trying to do. One of them was a 78-year-old man who remembered his grandmother, and the other was a 61-year-old woman who had not spoken to her in weeks. By the end of September, the willows on the first crescent were 10 feet tall and woven thick enough to stop most of the wind. The stone walls of the house were 4 feet high, but cracked in places where the mortar had dried too fast. The second crescent's stakes had rooted, but not as strongly. Alara had planted them in soil that was thinner than the first crescent's, and the swale she had dug without Prudence's guidance did not hold water as well. 16 of the stakes had died. 32 more were struggling. The house was rising. The willows were growing. The ridge was slowly becoming something that it had not been since the timber company stripped it bare. But Alara could see the cracks in the mortar, in the second crescent, in the gap where Prudence should have been and was not. She sat on the ridge at dusk, watching the last light catch the willow leaves, and she thought about what she had said. 37 years of watching and doing nothing. She thought about Prudence's face when she heard those words. She thought about Ada, who had died without ever planting what she wanted to plant. And she thought about what it must have cost Prudence to climb that ridge carrying 440 stakes that her own daughter never got to plant. She had been cruel. She had been right, but she had been cruel, and the cruelty mattered more than the rightness. She did not go to Prudence. Not yet. She was not ready yet, and she knew that going before she was ready would make it worse instead of better. But she stopped working on the second crescent. She focused on the first. She strengthened the walls of the house with better mortar, mixing it thicker, packing it tighter, filling the cracks that the wind would find when winter came. She worked. She waited. She listened to the wind move through the willows, and she thought about yielding. Because yielding was not just something willows did. Yielding was something people had to learn too, and she was only just beginning to understand what that meant. The ridge was changing around her. The bald earth was becoming something else. The willows were a living wall that breathed with the wind, and behind them the stone walls rose, and the air grew calmer with each passing week. And the cold space where hope had come to die was becoming warm. But winter was coming, and Garrick had received word that the railroad was shifting its route. His investments were turning to dust. His patience was turning to desperation. And desperate men do desperate things on cold nights when they believe they have nothing left to lose. The willows swayed in the autumn wind. They were 10 feet tall now, their leaves turning gold at the edges, and they moved with the gusts the way water moves around a stone, accepting, absorbing, transforming force into motion, and motion into stillness. Behind them, in the calm space they had created, Ilara's stone house stood, with its unfinished walls and its cracked mortar and its door that faced south. And inside the house, beside the fire, Ilara sat with the betting slip from Colton Briggs in one hand and a willow stake in the other. The betting slip said she would be gone by October 1st. Tomorrow was October 1st. She put the slip back in her pocket and turned the willow stake over in her hands. It was fresh cut, green and alive, ready to root. She had cut it that morning from the first crescent, from one of the original 440 that Prudence had carried up the ridge. She would plant it tomorrow, on October 1st, in the spot where Colton Briggs had stood and laughed. And she would still be here. But first, there was a night to get through, and then there would be many nights to get through after that. And somewhere in those nights, the wind would bring something worse than cold, something worse than mockery, something that smelled like smoke and tasted like fear, and left scars that would last forever. The willows swayed. The wind moved through them. And on the road below, in the darkness, a man in a suit that was no longer fine stood looking up at the ridge, with an expression that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with ruin. The night of the first fire came in late October. Ilara woke to thistle barking, not the alert bark that meant strangers approaching, but the frantic bark that meant danger, the bark that came from deep in the dog's chest, urgent and sharp, the kind of sound that pulls you from sleep the way a hand pulls you from water. She was out of her blankets and through the door of the half-finished stone house before she was fully awake, running toward the sound of the dog's voice, running toward the orange glow that was spreading across the southern edge of the willow crescent. Fire. The willows were on fire. She could see the flames licking up the woven branches, could smell the smoke on the wind, could hear the crackle and hiss of green wood fighting against the heat. The fire was not spreading quickly. The willows were too wet, too full of sap, too alive to burn easily. But it was spreading. one branch to the next, climbing the woven lattice, reaching for the sky with orange fingers. "Rowan!" she screamed. "Rowan, wake up!" Her brother came running from the shelter they still sometimes used, the depression behind the old stump where they had slept their first night on the ridge. His face was pale in the firelight, his eyes wide. "What happened?" "Get water! Get the buckets! Go!" They fought the fire for 2 hours. They beat at the flames with blankets. They threw water that they hauled from the swale in buckets. They dug dirt and threw it on the burning branches. Thistle ran back and forth, barking at the fire, as if barking might intimidate it into stopping. By the time the gray light of dawn began to show in the eastern sky, the fire was out. 60 willow trees had burned, their branches blackened, their leaves gone, their woven structure reduced to charcoal. But the roots were still alive. Ilara knelt in the ash and felt the soil around one of the burned stumps. It was warm from the fire, but beneath the warmth, she could feel moisture. She could feel life. "The roots are still there," she said. Rowan sat down heavily in the grass beside her. His face was streaked with soot. His hands were blistered from beating at the flames. He looked at the gap in the willow crescent where 60 trees had stood, and his expression was the expression of someone who had almost given up. "Someone said it," he said quietly. "I found footprints, 2 men, and I found this." He held up a piece of paper. Ilara took it and held it up to the dawn light. It was a betting slip. Colton Briggs, $2. Whitmore girl gone by October 1st. The fire had come 2 weeks after Colton had lost his bet. Ilara folded the paper and put it in her pocket with the first betting slip. She had 2 now. 2 pieces of evidence. 2 reminders. "We do not tell anyone," she said. "What?" "We do not accuse. We do not complain. We do not give them the satisfaction of knowing they hurt us. Ilara, they burned our trees. And the roots are still alive. The trees will grow back. Everything they tried to destroy will come back stronger than before." She stood up and looked at the gap in the crescent, at the charred stumps that would soon sprout new growth. "We replant the stakes, we fill the gap, and we let our success be our answer." She walked to the pile of willow stakes she had been saving for the expansion of the second crescent. She picked up 60 of them. She walked to the burned section of the first crescent and began to plant. Rowan watched her for a moment. Then he stood up and joined her. The second fire came 3 nights later, but this time it was not boys with betting slips and borrowed matches. This time it was Silas Garrick himself. He had received the final word about the railroad. The line that was supposed to come through the county was going north instead, where another man had made better deals with better officials. Garrick had invested everything he had in land that would now never be worth what he paid for it. The fine suit was no longer fine. The polished shoes were scuffed. The smile that had never reached his eyes had disappeared entirely, replaced by something hollow and broken that was worse than any smile. He came up the ridge after midnight, not drunk, not entirely, but desperate in a way that had burned away whatever caution he once possessed. He carried a bottle in one hand and a torch in the other, and he moved through the darkness with the unsteady purpose of a man who has nothing left to lose and has decided to make sure that someone else loses too. Thistle heard him coming and started barking before he reached the willow crescent. Alara was out of the house before he got close enough to do damage, but Rowan was closer. Rowan had been sleeping outside, in the grass near the gap they had replanted, keeping watch in case whoever had set the first fire came back. He saw Garrick coming before Alara did. He ran to intercept him. "Get off our land!" he shouted. Garrick swung the torch at him. Rowan dodged, but not fast enough. The torch caught the sleeve of his shirt, and the sleeve caught fire. The flame climbed the fabric in an instant, faster than thought, faster than reaction. The dry cotton ignited the way paper ignites, and Rowan's arm was burning. Alara heard her brother scream. She ran. She ran toward the sound, ran faster than she had ever run in her life. She reached Rowan and tackled him to the ground and smothered the flames with her own coat. Her mother's coat. The coat that smelled of lavender and had already lost a piece of itself to this ridge. She pressed the wool against her brother's burning arm and felt the heat through the fabric, and heard the hiss of flame dying against wool, and heard Rowan crying out in pain beneath her. The smell hit her then. Burning fabric and burning skin. She would never forget that smell. It would live in her memory longer than the fire itself, longer than the fear. The smell of her brother's flesh burning because a man in a ruined suit had decided that if he could not have this ridge, no one would. She could see Garrick standing there with the torch still in his hand. His face was lit orange by the flame, and the expression on it was half triumph and half terror. The expression of a man who has done something terrible and knows it, and cannot undo it. Thistle reached him first. The dog hit Garrick like a stone from a sling. 40 pounds of fury and loyalty launched from the darkness. Garrick went down. The torch flew from his hand and landed in the grass, where it sputtered and died against the damp soil. Thistle stood over him, growling, her teeth bared, and Garrick did not move, because he understood, with the clarity that fear brings, that the dog would not let him move. Alara dragged Rowan away from the scene. His right arm was burned from wrist to elbow, the skin red and blistered, and he was shaking with pain and shock. "I am okay," he said, though he clearly was not. "I am okay, Alara. Quiet! Let me see." She examined the burns in the moonlight. They were bad, but not as bad as they could have been. The shirt had taken the worst of it. The skin was damaged, but not destroyed. The blisters were rising already, fluid-filled and angry, but the tissue beneath was intact. He would heal. He would scar. But he would keep his arm. "We need prudence," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. She had not spoken to Prudence in weeks. She had not apologized for what she had said about 37 years of watching and doing nothing. But in this moment, with her brother's arm burned and a man pinned under her dog and the smell of smoke still thick in the air, pride was a luxury she could not afford. She left Rowan on the grass and walked to where Garrick lay, pinned beneath Thistle's watchful eye. He looked up at her with an expression that had lost all its confidence, all its menace. He looked small. He looked broken. He looked like what he was, a man who had gambled everything on a railroad that never came, and had tried to burn down the only person who had not gambled at all. "You burned my brother," she said. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that is worse than screaming, because it means the person speaking has moved past anger into something harder and colder and more permanent. "I did not mean," You came to my land in the middle of the night with fire in your hand. You burned my willows once. You tried to burn them again. And you burned my brother. It was an accident. No, it was a choice. You chose to come here. You chose to bring fire. You chose to swing at a 15-year-old boy. She stood over him. The moonlight was behind her, and her face was in shadow, and Garrett could not see her eyes, but he could feel them. I am going to let you go, she said. Thistle is going to let you go. You are going to walk down this ridge, and you are never going to come back. And if you do come back, if you ever set foot on this ridge again, I will make sure that everyone in this county knows what you did tonight. Every detail, every choice, every scar on my brother's arm. Thistle stepped back. Garrick scrambled to his feet. He did not look at Alara. He did not look at the dog. He ran down the ridge in the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, and Alara stood and watched him go, and did not feel satisfaction or triumph or relief. She felt tired. She felt old. She felt like she was 18 years old, and she had lived 100 years in the months since her uncle had put her things on the porch. She went back to Rowan. Can you walk? I think so. Then we are going to Prudence. The cabin in the hollow was dark when they arrived. Alara knocked on the door and waited, and knocked again. She could hear movement inside, the slow shuffle of someone waking in the middle of the night, the creak of a wooden floor. The door opened. Prudence stood in the doorway in a nightgown, with a candle in her hand and her white hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at Alara. She looked at Rowan, at the burned arm he held against his chest, at the pain on his face. She looked at Thistle, who was pressed against Rowan's leg, whimpering softly. She did not ask what happened. She did not ask why they had come. She stepped aside and let them in. Ezra stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching, saying nothing. He had not said a single word since they arrived, but his presence was a kind of speech. Steady, solid. The presence of a man who understood that sometimes the best thing you can do is stand in a doorway and be there. Prudence bandaged the burns with a salve made from willow bark and honey. She worked with hands that were gnarled with age, but gentle with practice. She cleaned the blisters and applied the salve and wrapped the arm in clean cloth. And while she worked, she talked. Not about what had happened, not about Garrick or fire or fear. She talked about willow bark, about how it had been used for pain for longer than anyone could remember, about how the tree that Garrick had tried to destroy was now healing the wound that Garrick had caused. Willow bark, Rowan said, wincing as she applied the salve. Of course, Prudence said. Willow has been healing for 1,000 years. The pain will stop soon. The skin will heal in a few weeks. The scar will stay. I do not mind scars. Good, because this one will be with you for the rest of your life. When the bandaging was done, and Rowan was resting in a chair by the fire with Thistle curled at his feet, Prudence sat down across from Alara. The candle between them threw shadows on the walls. The hollow was quiet. The wind was distant here, muffled by the trees that grew thick in the bottomland. The mortar in your walls is cracked, Prudence said. Alara looked at her. I have been watching, not coming up, but watching from below. The cracks run along the north face where the wind hits hardest. The gaps are small now, but winter will find them. Water will get in, freeze, expand. By the coldest night, those cracks will be an inch wide, and the wind will cut through your walls like they are made of paper. I know, Ilara said. You knew when you built them. You built too fast. I know that, too. Prudence leaned forward. I was wrong to leave you, she said. You said a hard thing, and it was a true thing, and I did not want to hear it. 37 years. You were right about that. I watched this ridge go bald for 37 years, and I did nothing, because doing nothing was easier than failing. And I was wrong to say it the way I said it, Ilara replied. You did not do nothing. You kept the knowledge alive. You kept it until someone needed it. That is not nothing. That is everything. They sat in silence for a moment. The fire crackled. Rowan's breathing had steadied. Thistle sighed in her sleep. We need to fix the mortar before winter, Ilara said. Yes. Will you show me how? Prudence smiled. It was a small smile, tired, but real. I will show you how, and you will listen this time. I will listen. They went up the ridge together the next morning. Prudence and Ilara, side by side, with a bucket of clay mortar mixed to Prudence's specifications, thicker and richer than what Ilara had used before. They filled the cracks. They sealed the gaps. They worked in silence for most of the morning, and the silence was not the silence of anger or distance. It was the silence of two people who had hurt each other and forgiven each other, and now had work to do. By the time they finished, the stone walls were solid. Not beautiful. Not the smooth, precise walls that a mason would build, but solid, tight, ready for whatever the wind would bring. Winter came. It came the way winter comes to the hill country, not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming. One day the willows were gold and trembling in autumn wind. The next day, the sky was the color of iron, and the temperature dropped, and the first snow fell thick and fast, and did not stop until the ridge was buried under 2 feet of white. The wind came from the northwest at a force that drove the snow sideways, piling it in drifts against every obstacle. The exposed slopes of the ridge disappeared under white. The grass that had grown sideways now lay flat under the weight of snow and ice. The world became a place of white and gray, and the howling sound of wind that had nothing to stop it. Nothing except the willows. The willow crescent was bare now, its leaves gone, stripped away by the first hard frost. The branches were brown and skeletal against the white sky, and anyone looking at them from the road below would have said they were dead, would have said the fence of sticks had finally become what it always was, dead wood in a ditch. But the branches were not dead. They were woven tight, hundreds of them interlaced into a lattice that the wind could not pass through without losing its force. The snow piled against the windward side of the crescent, 6 feet deep in places, and the snow itself became insulation, another wall added to the living wall, a barrier of white that the wind had built against itself. Inside the crescent, the world was different. The snow was thin. The wind was a whisper. The stone house stood with its sealed walls and its cedar pole roof and its chimney that drew perfectly. And inside the house, the fire burned, and the stones absorbed the heat and radiated it back into the room. But the night Alara feared most was still coming. It came in the deepest part of winter, a storm that buried the ridge under fresh snow and drove the wind to speeds that made the willow branches scream. The temperature dropped beyond anything Ilara had felt on this ridge, colder than the spring nights when she and Rowan had shivered in the hollow behind the stump, colder than anything she had prepared for. Rowan was sick. The burn on his arm had healed on the surface, but the wound beneath had festered and broken open again in the cold, and infection had set in. His skin was hot while the world outside was freezing. His eyes were glassy. He shivered not from cold, but from fever, and Alara sat beside him and pressed wet cloth to his forehead, and listened to the wind, and wondered if this was the night when everything would end. The fire was burning. The chimney was drawing. The stones were warm. But the cold pressed against the walls from outside like a living thing trying to get in. And Alara could feel it, could feel the weight of it, the patience of it, the certainty that it had all the time in the world, and she did not. She looked at her mother's coat, draped over Rowan for warmth, the coat that was missing a square from the back, the coat that had been pressed against his burning arm on the night of the fire, the coat that smelled of lavender and smoke and sacrifice, the coat that no longer looked like anything her mother had worn, but still held, somehow, the shape of love. "Mama," she whispered. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a word spoken into the darkness by a girl who was not sure she had done enough. The wind howled. The willows screamed. The snow pressed against the walls, and the walls held. The dawn came gray and silent. The storm had passed. The wind still blew, but it blew with less fury, as if the night had exhausted even the wind. Ilara opened the door of the stone house and stepped outside. The world was white. The ridge was buried. The exposed slopes were fields of snow and ice, hostile and barren. The kind of landscape that kills livestock and breaks spirits and sends families packing for warmer places. But inside the Willow Crescent, the snow was thin. The wind was gentle. The bare branches had caught the worst of the storm and redirected it, transformed it, turned a killing force into something that barely stirred the air. The temperature inside the crescent was cold but livable. The temperature outside was not. Rowan appeared in the doorway behind her. He was pale, his arm bandaged, his body thin from fever, but his eyes were clear. The infection had broken in the night. The worst was past. "It is warm," he said. "Warmer than outside." "Yes." He stepped out beside her. He looked at the Willow Crescent, at the bare branches woven tight against the white sky, at the snow piled 6 feet deep on the windward side. "You did it," he said. "We did it." "No," he shook his head. "You did it, Alara. You understood something that nobody else understood. That you cannot fight the wind. That you have to move with it. That you have to grow things that yield instead of things that shatter." He held up his scarred arm. The bandage was dirty and the skin beneath was raw, but the arm was whole, and it was his, and it was proof that he had stood on this ridge and survived what the ridge had thrown at him. "Mama was right," he said. "Wind is just air in a hurry, and you asked it to slow down. And it listened." Jasper Thornwood came to the ridge in the weeks that followed. He did not come to criticize. He did not come to mock. He came because his own house was freezing, because his firewood was running low, because this winter was the harshest anyone could remember, and he was beginning to wonder if the orphan girl on the ridge had known something that he did not. He stood outside the Willow Crescent for a long time before he entered. The wind pushed at his back, cut through his coat, numbed his fingers, even inside his gloves. But when he stepped through the archway that Alara had woven into the willow wall, when he entered the calm space behind the living windbreak, he felt the change immediately. The air was still. The cold was less. The wind that had been trying to kill him was suddenly gentle, reduced to a breeze that barely moved his hair. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, "may I speak with you?" Ilara appeared in the doorway of her stone house. She was wearing a wool sweater, but no coat. She was comfortable enough inside the crescent to dress for autumn in the middle of winter. "Mr. Thornwood." He stopped. He looked at the willows. He looked at the stone house. He looked at the girl who had not left. He was not a man who apologized easily. He was not a man who admitted mistakes. But the evidence was overwhelming. "I was wrong," he said. "I called you foolish. I said you were burying your hope in the dirt. I said you would be gone by July, and then by October, and then by the first snow. I was wrong about all of it." "Yes," Ilara said, "you were." She did not say it with cruelty. She did not say it with triumph. She said it as a simple statement of fact. "May I see how you built this? The willows, the ditch, all of it?" Ilara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had mocked her, who had bet against her, who had told everyone in the county that she would fail. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee, and then I will show you everything." He was not the last. By the end of winter, a steady stream of visitors was climbing the ridge. Farmers whose fences had blown down, homesteaders whose roofs had failed, families whose livestock had died in the cold. They came to see the willows. They came to understand how a girl with no resources and no experience had built something that worked when their own buildings had not. Ilara taught them. She taught them how to dig a swale along a contour line. She taught them how to cut willow stakes and plant them 12 inches apart. She taught them how to weave the growing branches into a dense wall that moved with the wind instead of fighting it. She did not charge for the teaching. She did not demand payment or favors. She taught because teaching was how knowledge survived. Because her mother had known these things, and Prudence's grandmother had known these things, and the chain of knowledge stretched back through generations of women who understood that wisdom meant nothing if it died with the person who held it. "Why do you not charge?" Rowan asked one evening, after a particularly long day of visitors. "Because charging makes it a transaction. Teaching makes it a legacy." "We could use the money." "We have enough." She looked around the stone house, at the fire burning in the hearth, at the food stored in the root cellar, at the warmth that surrounded them while the wind howled outside. "We have more than enough, and what we give away comes back in other ways." She was right. The farmers who learned from her brought gifts. flour and salt and preserved meat. The homesteaders who planted willows from her stock sent their children to help with the work. The families who survived the winter because of her teaching became allies, friends, parts of a community that had once mocked her and now sought her counsel. That night, after the last visitor had gone, Alara sat alone by the fire. Rowan was asleep. The house was warm, the wind was distant, and she realized, with a surprise that felt almost like grief, that she was lonely. Not the loneliness of being alone on a ridge. She had grown used to that. This was the loneliness of being surrounded by people who admired her, and none of them knowing her. They saw the willows. They saw the house. They saw the girl who had refused to leave. They did not see the girl who had cut her mother's coat and cried in a box of mud and said cruel things to the only woman who had helped her. She pulled her mother's coat around her shoulders, the coat that was missing pieces now, the coat that smelled of smoke more than lavender. And she thought about what Prudence had said about carrying knowledge, that the carrying was the point, not the knowing, the carrying. But carrying is heavy. And sometimes the people who carry the most are the ones who say the least about the weight. Reverend Whitmore apologized on a Sunday morning. He did it publicly, from the pulpit, in front of the same congregation he had preached to about pride and foolishness. "I spoke of pride," he said. His voice was not as confident as it had been. His certainty was not as certain. "I spoke of pride as if it were always a sin. But I have learned that there is a difference between pride and certainty." Miss Whitmore was not prideful. She was certain. She was certain because she had knowledge that I did not have. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood the wind in ways that I did not understand. He paused. He looked out at his congregation. "I called her prideful from this pulpit. I was wrong." She said nothing. She only worked. She only planted. She only built. And when her work spoke for itself, she did not gloat. She taught. I ask her forgiveness. In the back of the church, Ilara sat with Rowan beside her and Thistle at their feet. She did not stand. She did not speak. She simply listened. And when the Reverend finished, she nodded. Not in forgiveness, in acknowledgement. It was enough. And on the road that led south out of town, Ilara saw Silas Garrick one last time. He was walking. No horse, no wagon. His suit was wrinkled and stained. His shoes were muddy. He was carrying everything he owned in a single bag, the way Ilara had carried everything she owned in a canvas sack on the morning her uncle put her things on the porch. Their eyes met. Neither of them stopped walking. Neither of them spoke. Garrick nodded, one small movement of his head. Ilara nodded back, and that was all. He walked south, and she walked north, and the wind blew between them, and the willows on the ridge swayed in that wind, alive and rooted and yielding to what they could not fight. Garrick would find work in another county. Day labor, odd jobs, the slow rebuilding of a life that had been built on other people's losses. He would never come back to the ridge. But he would live. He would live with what he had done and what had been done to him. And that was its own kind of justice. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way that stories usually demand, but real. The kind of justice that does not announce itself, but simply exists. The way wind exists. The way scars exist. The way the memory of fire exists in the grain of wood that survived it. By the following spring, 5 farms in the county had willow windbreaks. By the summer, 12. By the autumn, 30. The knowledge moved the way water moves through hill country. Downhill. Naturally. Finding the paths of least resistance, pooling in the low places where people gathered, spreading outward through creek beds and fence lines, and conversations held over kitchen tables. A farmer would plant willows along his north fence, and his neighbor would see the difference and ask how it was done, and the neighbor would plant willows along his own fence, and his neighbor's neighbor would ask the same question, and the answer would travel another mile down the road. Emmeline Garner married at 19 and moved to a farm in the next county. She carried 3 things with her from her old life: her notebooks, filled with observations and diagrams and measurements taken on the ridge over 3 years of learning; a bundle of willow stakes, fresh cut from the first crescent, and the knowledge of how to dig a swale along a contour line, and why yielding matters more than fighting. Within a few years, she had taught 24 families the method. Within a few more, she had written a pamphlet that was distributed throughout the eastern hill country. The pamphlet did not mention Elara by name. It did not need to. The knowledge had grown beyond its source, the way willow grows beyond its stake, the way a root system spreads underground until the surface barely hints at what lies beneath. That was how it was supposed to be. That was what legacy meant. Something that grows so far beyond its origin that the origin becomes invisible. Margaret Holloway never apologized publicly. She was not the kind of woman who admitted mistakes in front of others. But she sent her hired man to buy 50 willow stakes from Elara at 2 cents each, and she planted them along her vegetable garden without telling anyone. When the willows grew and her tomatoes produced twice what they had before, she said nothing. But she stopped calling Elara that poor orphan girl. And she sent her youngest daughter to learn the technique. Sometimes silence is its own kind of apology. Thistle died in the spring, many years after she had followed a boy off a porch and into the wind. She was old for a dog, gray around the muzzle, slow on the hills she had once patrolled with such fierce attention. She spent her last days lying in the sun beside the first willow tree, the one that had been a stake on a May morning and was now a tree with a trunk thicker than Rowan's leg. She died with her head in Elara's lap, looking up with eyes that held no pain and no fear, only the calm recognition of a dog who had done her work and was ready to rest. Rowan carved a stone for her. It said only, "She knew when to stay." Elara sat beside the grave for a long time after the burial was done. The wind moved through the willow branches above her, making the sound she had come to think of as the ridge breathing. Thistle had been there for all of it. The failures, the fires, the freezing nights and the mornings that followed. She had known before anyone else when danger was coming, and she had known without being told that this ridge was home. Thank you, Alara said to the grave, "for following us that day, for knowing that home is where you decide it is." Prudence Ashford died on a morning in autumn, several years after the first willow stakes went into the ground on the ridge. She had been sick for weeks, her body finally surrendering to the years it had carried. She lay in her bed in the cabin in the hollow, with Ezra sitting beside her, and Alara on the floor holding her hand. Through the window, Prudence could see the ridge. She could see the green fortress that had grown from 440 willow stakes planted in a ditch on a windy morning. The willows were massive now, 20 feet tall, with trunks as thick as a man's leg. The woven sections had become impenetrable walls of living wood. The stone house had grown, with additions and outbuildings and a proper barn. And surrounding it all, expanding in rings across the slopes, were the second and third crescents that Alara had planted over the years. Each one adding another layer of protection, another buffer against the wind that still blew, but could no longer reach the heart of the ridge. "My grandmother would have planted more," Prudence said. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. "I did plant more," Alara replied. "I know. I watched." Prudence squeezed her hand, a gentle pressure, barely there. "She would be proud, my grandmother. She would be proud of you, of what you built, of what you taught." Prudence turned her head on the pillow. Her white hair spread across the linen like the roots of a willow laid bare. "Do not stop teaching," she said. "Do not ever stop. That is how the knowledge lives. That is how we live, through what we pass on. I will not stop. Promise me." "I promise." Prudence smiled. It was a peaceful smile, the smile of someone who had done what she came to do and was ready to rest. The smile of a woman who had carried knowledge from one generation to the next and had found, at the end, that the carrying was the point, not the knowing. The carrying. "Tell Ezra to plant a willow stake on my grave," she said. "I want to keep growing." She closed her eyes. She did not open them again. They buried her on a Saturday in the small cemetery on the hill above the hollow. Half the county came. Farmers and homesteaders and townfolk gathered around the grave, all of them touched in some way by the knowledge that had traveled from Cornwall to a cabin in a hollow, to a bald ridge where an orphan girl had pushed dead sticks into the ground and called it faith. Alara stood at the grave and spoke. "Prudence Ashford came to my ridge on a morning when I had failed 3 times. She found me sitting in the ruins of my third shelter, and she said something that changed everything. She said, 'You cannot build on this ridge. You can only grow on it.'" She paused. She looked at the crowd gathered around the grave. She was right. Everything I built, the wind destroyed. But what I grew, the wind could not touch. She taught me that. Her grandmother taught her. And now that knowledge is alive in every willow that grows on every farm in this county. She knelt beside the grave. In her hand, she held a willow stake, fresh cut that morning, identical to the ones Prudence had carried up the ridge all those years before. "She asked me to plant this on her grave," Alara said. She wanted to keep growing. She pushed the stake into the soft earth beside the headstone. She tamped it down with her boot heel. She stood and stepped back. "She will keep growing," she said, "and so will we." The years passed. Rowan built a home in the Eastern Hollow. He married. He had children. He planted a willow windbreak around his own property, and when people asked about the scar on his right arm, he called it his map home. Because the scar pointed northeast, toward the ridge, toward his sister, toward the place where he had learned that love is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to stand between someone you love and the fire that would burn them. Elara was 32. Her hair was starting to gray early, the way her mother's had. Her hands were calloused and strong from years of work. She lived in the stone house on the ridge, alone now, except for the wind and the willows and the memory of a dog buried beneath the first tree and a woman who had kept growing even after she was gone. She had built something that would outlast her, and she knew it, and she was at peace with it, in the way that people are at peace when they have stopped trying to be remembered and have started trying to be useful. The ridge was green. The county was changed. The knowledge was alive in hands she had never shaken, and on farms she had never visited, and in notebooks she had never read. That was enough. That was more than enough. If you drove through the hill country today, through the rolling green ridges and the deep hollows and the farms that line the creek bottoms, you would see willow windbreaks on almost every property. They line the fence rows and the creek banks and the exposed hillsides where the wind blows strongest. Thousands of them. Descendants, all of them, of 440 stakes that a white-haired woman carried up a bald ridge one spring morning to teach a desperate girl how to grow instead of build. And if you turned off the main road and followed the winding lane up into the hills, you would come to a ridge that the old maps call by a name that sounds like a girl's name. The stone house still stands. The willows still grow. The wind still blows across the exposed slopes, swaying the grass into angles, pushing clouds across the sky. But inside the crescent, inside the calm space that a desperate girl created from nothing but knowledge and stubbornness and faith, the air is still. The ground is sheltered. The wind that howls on every other ridge arrives here as a breeze that barely stirs the leaves. There is a marker at the edge of the first crescent. It was placed there by the people who remembered long after the girl had gone. It bears her name and two lines that say everything that needs to be said. She could not build on this ridge, so she grew on it instead. And beside the marker, growing from roots that have been in the ground longer than most people have been alive, a willow tree sways in the wind. It does not fight. It does not shatter. It simply moves and yields and breathes and lives. The wind pushes. The willow bends. And the bending is not weakness. The bending is how it survives.